So thank you so much. Thank you.
And I have a few different practices, and they converge in many different meaningful ways, but I've really professionalized as a curator and writer, and I work a lot around access, living and loving with disability communities, and I also have a holistic death care practice. And so for those that don't know about the work of death doulas, this is a non-medical support role that's really focused on education, guidance, and support around death, dying, loss, and grief. And so these different practices of mine really converge into this book, which is really wonderful to share with you tonight. It's called Dying Livingly, and it came out earlier this year, just 1 month after I had my first child. So it's been really something to have 2 babies like this. And so it's really focused on the first few years of developing this holistic death care practice of mine. And so I will certainly talk more about it, but especially through conversation with Jessica, which I'm really looking forward to. And before I go further into it, I also just really want to acknowledge the space that we're in. And, you know, it's really something to be able to have an event like this in the context of art and culture to talk about death and grief, especially because it is so profoundly varied. And in this kind of setting, you know, there's so much that you all are bringing also to this conversation and to the space. We all have a relationship with death. And so I just want to recognize the different kinds of pain that's here and to welcome it. And also because, you know, it's really a privilege to be able to talk about death and dying like this. But that is a privilege really to do some powerful things with together. And yeah, I think that we can absolutely talk about it more too, but the relationship between individual and collective death care, between so-called natural death from advanced aging or a good death, and the relationship between bad death, lives taken, and violence. Like the relationship between these is really important to talk about. So thank you so much for being here, and really looking forward to this. So what we had talked about doing is that we would each share a contribution to each other and also to all of you. And so a little bit of our work. And then we will then open up into more conversation about connections, and then have a chance to be able to talk with all of us here. And is there anything that you wanted to add after what I just said, or just
No.
Okay. Okay. So the book is really a coming of age story, I think. And there are different chapters in the book, and not one chapter really represents the book. It's really to be read as a collection, and it's quite a pocketbook. I maybe joke a little bit that I don't think a book about death and dying should be big. But I wanted to have a chance to be able to write in different ways. So this is really special to get to do so. But it really, it is really between like quite personal texts to more research, studious ones, from my own experiences of working with an artist who was at the end of her life, to, the recent history of modern hospice care. I'm also exploring ecological death care and new forms of body disposition. I'm also looking at more like futuristic, experimental models of hospice, playing around with that kind of imagination of the sort of care that we want, that many of us want. It's also, it's just incredibly varied. Death realism, this chapter is also really focused on what it means to make space for how we are witnessing death and how we are able to learn through image and language. So maybe something interesting for Jessica and I to talk about too. But anyways, and lastly, there is one that is really focused on what it means to be a death doula for a family who would never seek the services of a death doula. So yeah, very, very different kinds of texts. But what I would like to read is maybe about 7 minutes long. And it's of the chapter that's called Eulogy for Before and After. And there's quite a few texts that are dedicated to people. This is one of them. And I really wanted to focus not on the spectacle of the dying events, but the life that surrounds it. And I really wanted to do this too because there's a lot of, and you'll hear it here and there, that there's a lot of connections with water. And I think that's a really special point between Jessica and I. Eulogy for Before and After, for Katja and her mother, Carla. I walk through the front garden and stand at the door. My eyes trace the door in its white frame, following its edges, drifting to chips and signs of life in the paint. I locate the bell, but don't press it yet. I walk through every day for decades. I try to fathom this for a moment, but I can't comprehend it. I imagine her hand gathering strength around the doorknob, though I haven't met her yet. Images flash through my mind. She's setting down groceries, wading through the waters of her purse, jangling keys. I was gathering my courage because this door is a portal. She had been dying, but just 30 minutes ago she died by euthanasia. I had waited at an ice cream shop nearby with your partner. We didn't have ice cream until you texted to let us know it was okay for us to come over. You and your sister were with your mom for her last breath. You and I have talked daily for the last 2 weeks during the final phase of your mother's life. Instead of ringing the bell, I knock and you welcome me inside. I enter as slowly as I can, as if wading carefully into the ocean. The space is thick with emotion. I reach another door frame, one that leads to the room where she is laid out, where she had died, where she had been dying, where once she had rested, and where once she had been very much alive. I touch this door frame. I learned from my mentor to always do this when I enter the sacred space of death. With the plastic paint underneath my palm, I slow myself down even further. In my mind, I ask for her permission to enter. Once I arrive at her bedside, I kneel down and introduce myself. She had heard about me. And then I seek her warm hand. Hi, Carla. I'm here to take care of your daughters in whichever ways I can. Carla's bed was arranged in the dining area of the living room so that she could be next to the large sliding glass window and have the view of her brimming, untamed, yet cared-for garden. In front of the bed is a large shelf, densely filled with books from bottom to top. CDs and photo albums are also stacked in the corners. Various items are strewn around the bed. A box of tissues, cups, bowls, ointments, a toothbrush and mouthwash, a pen and notebook, some sticky notes, her glasses, some medical supplies. Evidence of the 2-week encampment that you all shared. Nearby bulletin boards are packed with photos of you, your sister, and other loved ones, as well as dozens of images of colorful, geometric quilts your mother had made. Vessels and containers of different kinds are dotted throughout the home. Soft plush animals, trinkets, rocks rest on shelves. At the other end of the living room is another full bookshelf, but triple the size. Then I learned that there are even more books upstairs. Some of your artworks or flyers for your exhibitions are on display in different places. Handwritten notes and images cover the refrigerator in the kitchen. There was a note to self in her upstairs study stuck to a shelf. Lyrics from a very cellular song by the incredible string band. O-I-E-O, there's absolutely no strife, living the timeless life. Listening to this 12-minute recording later, I imagined that Carla lived a lot like this wild, fervent jam of a song. I drank it up. We are surrounded by Carla's extraordinary life, which has grown around her like a placenta. The house and the objects that fill it have special details and are layered with use and meaning. Some objects are like talisman, some peculiar in their origin and function, all of it idiosyncratic. You come across another one of her notes, this time an assignment. Search. A daisy, a moss, a blade of grass, a shell, a spine, something soft, something hard, something wet. Carla's ways of documenting, collecting, and making demonstrate her love of and devotion to relationships of all kinds with the more than human world. The interior of her house is a mosaic of her character. While this could be typical of someone in the older years of her life, I could sense from being within Carla's cabinet of curiosities that she was exceptional. Her depth of wonder and awe is only possible because she had looked pain and grief in the eyes. It is also no surprise that she would face death with so much courage. Choosing euthanasia, of course, but also having the words, niet reanimeren, do not resuscitate, tattooed on her chest and encircled by a heart, a design by you and your sister at an earlier moment when dealing with this cancer. Some hours later, after helping you bathe your mom, an intimacy that will always stay with us, you call the funeral director to send a driver to pick up her body and take her to the crematorium for refrigeration until the funeral. You, your sister, and partner help to prop her up in the large wooden casket so she doesn't look so small. She is now dressed in her pre-selected outfit, in all blue, her favorite color, ensemble, and her body is covered by one of her own handmade blankets. You and your sister carry her outside with the driver, and the two of you place her inside of the hearse, one of the many actions you've taken and will continue to do together on this journey. I stay inside and remove the sheets from the bed. She had produced dozens of blankets and pillows featuring her nature photography, and I find one such blanket, with a grid-like pattern of many stunning and diverse birds with long beaks in water habitats, actually in the Everglades. Top of the mattress as if making the bed. I position a plush bunny on top of a neat stack of as many of her pillows as I could find. I place a watercolor drawing from your niece below the pillows, and then make a vertical row of the books you had read from during the bathing ritual, including Beamed Gras and Stricklicht by one of her favorite writers, the Dutch poet Judith Herzberg. Nothing could ease the pain of this loss, but I wanted you and your sister to return and not see an empty, messy bed, but instead a small, carefully constructed memorial. It is evening and starting to get dark. It is time for me to leave. I talk about how I would return soon, how we would come together a few more times over the next year, as you, your sister, and your loved ones began cleaning the house and sorting out all of your mother's beloved objects. It will be tough, but should be approached as if taking small sips of water. I did not know you when your parents were alive, but I know you now. We say goodbye, both grateful, and I exit as slowly as I entered. Before leaving, I stand again at the portal of the door and gaze at the room, awestruck. The place shimmers with the vibration of your love. I praise everything that was left. Thank you.
I think that is my favorite chapter, actually. Yeah. The epistolatory style, the letter style, and arranging the memorial in that way. And I think there's something really important about writing and like taking lists and keeping note of everything around death and being a witness. Thank you. You said that was the first time reading that chapter?
Yeah, in the context of the book events. Of course, the water connections and connected to you. And it's also really special that I just saw Katja last week. And also special that Carla loved the Everglades.
Wow.
So that quilt that I mentioned with the birds in the water habitat, that is the Everglades, the water habitat. So
Staci and I both grew up in Florida. So
and the Everglades are it's just an incredible ecosystem. It is prehistoric. It's like not even a swamp, it's a river. It's slowly moving water. So
yeah. I'm going to talk about another waterway system now. Let's see where I can be so you all can see. This is the Combahee River. This is footage of the Combahee River from a small port outside of Hilton Head Island in South Carolina that I recorded in July. And the overlay image is a river baptism in the community of Gullah descendants in North Carolina from 1930. So the name Combahee comes from an indigenous subtribe that is now extinct due to colonial genocide. The Combahee River was instrumental in the United States' largest human trafficking project, the transatlantic slave trade. And it's common knowledge that the trafficking routes that were used from European countries to African countries over the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas and the Caribbean were the primary source of chattel slavery. But less commonly known are the intra-American routes, meaning all of the waterways within the US that were used for trafficking enslaved Africans from one state to another. So the Combahee River was one of those waterways. You may have heard of the Combahee River Collective Statement, the 1974 written document by a group of Black queer feminists. That collective gets its name from a guerrilla operation 100 years earlier in 1863, which was the first major military operation led by a woman in the US. And the operation was led by formerly enslaved abolitionist Harriet Tubman, who was the grandmother of the Underground Railroad. And her operation freed 700 people, enslaved black people, over 2 days via this river. So this river is a site of death and also freedom. And I'm interested in how grief lives in the physical body, in the collective memory of the African diaspora, and in the Earth's natural resources, water, soil, and air. I'm contemplating or researching landscapes of death, or deathscapes, within the Black diaspora. So by deathscapes, I mean the spatio-temporal aspects and planes of transition between the living and the spirit worlds. So what are the tangible and intangible encounters of the ephemeral? How have African deathscapes been westernized over time and impacted by chattel slavery? So I'm making a connection between forced migration, both within the African continent and outside, and how these forced migrations have impacted the death and grieving rituals. So I'm mapping physical locations, metaphysical locations, external locations, and internal locations, and primarily waterways, including rivers, swamps, sounds, channels, waterfalls. They've become central to my research as storage sites of grief. So this is one of the locations that is altogether physical and metaphysical, external and internal. How does grief move communities and societies? So African deathscapes are a provocation to Western temporality. And by temporality in this context, I mean as it relates to African diasporic grieving rituals and their rejection of linear time. So in non-indigenous or Western global North traditions, death is linear and it follows a past, present, future structure. When someone dies, they're dead and gone. In the African diaspora, death is cyclical. When someone dies, the living and the spirit world still stay together. They're constantly in conversation, operating between different planes. So the dead are not actually dead, but they're living amongst us. The past, present, and future are intertwined, and children are ancestors. These ideas are modeled after the Congo cosmogram, which is a central symbol of the Bakongo religion. So the cosmogram existed as a symbol and value system long before European colonization. The Bakongo religion of West and Central Africa was one of the spiritualities that traveled across the Atlantic during the slave trade, and it's evolved over time. So the cosmogram represents the physical world, Kuinseke, and the spiritual world, Kuimbimpa, the Kalunga line, which is the watery boundary that connects the two worlds, the sacred river that circles the two worlds, the 4 moments of the sun, and the 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire. So both living persons and the souls of the dead are conceptualized as cycling through these incarnations counterclockwise. On the left is video footage that I recorded in Congo Square in New Orleans. Congo Square was a place where enslaved Africans would gather on their day off on Sundays. Because gathering in groups was illegal, they moved to the outskirts of New Orleans. And the mayor of New Orleans gave them this place called Place Congo to gather, where enslaved and free Black people could set up a market to sing, dance, drum, and commune. But it was also a place where they could express their spirituality freely, as they couldn't on the plantations. So they could practice hybrid rituals as well as hoodoo and voodoo. And now every Sunday, people still gather there for drum circles, and that's where this footage is from. So turning towards dying livingly, you talk about metabolizing grief into praise. And that makes me think a lot about sites like Congo Square and also the Combahee River.
I'm really touched by everything that you shared. Thank you. And there's so much that I want to talk to you about.
No,
I really have to gather myself because Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let me center myself here. Yeah. Yeah.
Just while you center yourself, so I was really touched to read what you wrote about Harriet Tubman and if you can share that.
Yeah.
About the
So
center.
It's so wonderful to meet and have these threads really, I don't know, rolled out and braided together, right? So in the latter part of Harriet Tubman's life, she really focused her energy on a care home for the elderly, ill, and dying. So it's incredible. It's in upstate New York. I went there, and it felt really profound to visit this place. It's still standing, the home, next to her museum, the Harriet Tubman Museum. So it's really incredible to think about these various legacies of death and dying, especially the care that's done within communities. And, for so long, death and dying happens in the home. And really, these sort of care homes that crop up over the past hundreds of years ago are really much more for those in transit and traveling and are able to stop and receive care. But also along the way, these kind of sites where people need long-term care, and also the sort of religious backing of such places, and also how that connects to morality, So a lot of connections with illness and disability here, but also addiction and class really come about here, like who is worthy of care. So there's just long histories about care, but so much of death midwifery, and I've grown up in the U.S. I've been living in the Netherlands for the past years, so these are really the contexts of which I know. And but death midwifery, as I understand it, especially in the context of the U.S., it was so many Black women who were helping white women care for the dying. I mean, there was so much birth and death midwifery that was shared. So the connections between, so many, so much of identity in place, how these are becoming hybrid, but the ways in which also production and social reproduction meddle together. Yes.
It really, we were speaking about how growing up in Florida and coming from, different lineages in terms of colonial lineages. And you talk about, the kind of mixing up of care stories and care work. It makes me think about this quote that I wanted to share with you from the poet Alexis Pauline Gumbs, where she writes that we are all entangled. And the fact that entanglement is a slow death doesn't make it any better. In fact, it makes it more gruesome. And I mourn the parts of you that lost feeling today. I mourn the scars you will not notice until you have a reason to grow. I mourn the freedom you don't know because these ropes have been here longer than you have been, and big or small, you can't evade them. So that just
really beautiful
to
bring in her work.
It made me think about how now death work should also be about reconciling these entanglements and our responsibility for them.
Essentially, the repair work that's done in the present to take care of the past and future. It sounds, I mean, this is also really the work that you're doing as well. Being able to honor those that weren't honored. How that care in the present has a way of healing. Same for me. My holistic death care is also so connected to my colonial ancestry. And I think so much too about how, you know, the poison and the medicine is like in our lines. That is, you know, when I am in the practice of death care in specific situations, it is a sort of transgenerational healing. Which is why it's also so important that, you know, this profound holistic death care movement that we are in is so much a response, you know, to so much mass death. And, you know, also just with modern hospice, which is really new. This is like post-World War II, was such a response to the Holocaust of that moment. So many of us are identifying that actually crisis reorganizes care, and we're part of that reorganization of care. As death and dying has become so medical, it's either like incredibly medicalized or it's incredibly violent. So connected to also conditions of living, of course, too. So yeah, I also wonder too, like how, you know, to come back to water, especially in your work, how you're also seeing this reparative process in your practice.
Well, that's one of the things I want to talk about. You write about the unseen. And something that I've been noticing more and more over the years is how spiritually inept a lot of people. And what I mean by that is that there's a resistance to look within oneself and to look at one's inner workings and mechanics and code of ethics and lineage and history. And because it's such deep spiritual work and it's such hard work, and it's a connection to and communing with a spiritual technology. And I see it in a lot of people whose ancestors intentionally forbade them to commune with spirits, and also in cultures and communities that have been Christianized over centuries, which is pretty much almost all of them. So, you know, from the Crusades to, you know, Christianization with Vikings here in Norway, to Christianization across the African continent, 14th, 15th century. And I see it in myself too when I get caught up and having, you know, parts of myself that are numb, as Alexis Pauline Gumbs writes. And so I think that one of the reparative acts has to be coming into community and also just doing the work, doing the, you know, like deep spiritual questioning work within yourself.
Absolutely same. And especially these times that we are living and also where we are living, how are we able to cultivate and nourish this community of the seen and unseen? Because I think in the West, death is done terribly. And we are brought, with death, we are brought to the edge of all of that westernization, of modernity, the material, the analytic, the rational, the measurable. And at some point, you are really pushed towards what is beyond. So yeah, that reparative practice too of just lineages of that. I can also feel it sometimes in ways that are hard to explain, because it is really challenging to explain. You know, even so much in like latest consciousness studies are revealing, or like natural death care practices are just revealing back to us what has been done by so many people around the world, across cultures, indigenous communities, of just how they have done death and dying. And the living and grieving that are so part of it. So I just wonder what that takes to live more with death in an intentional way. As I said before, that if we do have a personal relationship with death, and we all do, but we don't always have an intentional one where we're crafting and caring for our lives and also all of our relationships, living and dead. So much to say on this.
You're writing about death realism also in that way. One of the chapters in the book, Death Realism, about how we see death on a global scale. And so being confronted with death through multiple pandemics for some of us, climate crisis and state violence. You write, we struggle to viscerally align with and comprehend the amount of death and grief we are witnessing in contemporary life. And I'm also wondering what it takes to intentionally come into conversation with that when it's become so commonplace. I think that along with with colonialism and mass genocide, I think that avoiding the subject of death is an intentional colonial strategy. Because if death was talked about, then we would have to acknowledge, the reasonings behind it.
Yes. Yeah, that death phobia actually creates more violent death. That's, also a bit about what I'm trying to get to with the book in some ways, of what is the alternative? How to live with death or be led by death in ways that are affirming and valuing of life. And it also is really centered around, so in some ways, like back to the material, it is really centered around care, like what it looks and feels like. And I really believe in the transformative capacity to care and receive care and to be able to do that together, to change together.
And also to grieve together.
Yeah.
To make space for that grief and all of the unaddressed grief. That's another section in your book that you write about, neglected grief.
We are spiritually ill because of this. But so back to there is so many things I want to talk to you about. So I'm like, boom, boom, boom. But back to the material part, I do think that we can construct and build out our lives to be in better relationship with the truth of death, and also that death is a necessity. Pain and suffering is not. Pain actually is also a necessity. Suffering is not. Violence is not. And so I guess the other side too is, what does it mean to sort of build a capacity to be with pain and discomfort? It's also a part of also that work of healing that I think is really important, because it is painful. There's no way to dodge it. Grief has the pain associated with loss. There's no way to dodge it. We need that for our humanity. But how to sort of titrate and build up a capacity that is so that we can, stretch, not strain, like how to do it in ways that are actually just creating more connection and compassion, and on our terms, and on our culturally specific terms, what that means to do that. for me, it really comes up with disability and queerness of many levels. And it's really challenging, when we live in such an ableist society as well, where if death is seen as a better option than being able to live this in the conditions of living today that are so ableist, among other things, I'm not trying to say we need to build a capacity for pain for that, to be able to endure that. I really am interested in alternatives.
Are you working with alternatives in the hospice care that you do? I wanted to ask you about Grace's hospice as well, which is another chapter in the book, and hospice that you work with. If we see how much time we have, a little bit of time before questions.
Yeah, so the work of death doulas is so, radical and renegade in many ways. It's not institutionalized, totally professionalized work. There are many training programs, but it's not like it's not part of the medical system. It is really popping up in the cracks of the system that we're living in now. So there are very few hospices that I know of that actually work with death doulas. How hospice is today, it is so much part of the medical model that it is also based on healthcare and unpaid volunteer work. So the hospice where I volunteer, it is mostly pensioners. And so, that's something, like how actually, and there are different alternatives happening, especially that I know of in the US, where these third kind of spaces are popping up. They're more like homes that are opening up to their community so that people can die there. Also with hospice care that can come in and do a little bit of symptom management, but that's just a part, whereas the communal and the spiritual, the emotional part is what we're wanting more of. I think that technologies and medicine, we can keep people alive for a really long time. There's incredible science, but especially with this, that's not the goal. And there's also a lot of Silicon Valley kind of try to transcend death. Also, it's not the goal. Actually, how can caring for death help us care more for life? Yeah.
Okay, I think that's a beautiful place to have a couple of questions. I have many, many more questions.
Yeah,
and
well,
go ahead.
I just have one more for you,
Okay,
maybe,
yes,
and then
go
we can
ahead.
also, there's probably more for you too, but about image and language. Because this is also like a really incredible image that you just shared of the baptism ritual. I mean, the incredible rituals with water, or rituals that can ground us in the elements. But this overlaid with the river, how you're seeing, also as an artist, how you're seeing the ways in which you work with images as part of this, as part of this death and grief care work. How do you find it, and also where does language come in for you?
Well, in terms of images, I have to talk about the archive as a site, and as a site of deep instability. And by that I mean, I think that when I started this work on deathscapes in the African diaspora, I went to some physical archives only to be met with what I knew, which was that these stories and languages and modalities can't live in physical archives, they live in people. And so the images I think a lot about how when my ancestors were taken from West Africa, and how there were so many different languages and cultures, and they had to communicate in some way. A lot of it was through some sort of image work or drawing or creating hybrid languages. And so the kind of collaging that I do is to channel a little bit of these hybridities sometimes.
Beautiful. Yeah, well, I think probably also others have questions for you as well, too. But shall we?
Yeah.
Okay. That we can open this conversation up also, in case there are any questions, or also resonances, dissonances, anything that can also be shared. I think many people are also engaged in this work as well, too. So.
My name is Viola. I use pronouns they, them. I hear you talk about death work and grief work, and I just I work. I would say I work more with grief than direct death or bereavement, maybe, to be more precise. So maybe I just want to hear both of you around what is the difference, what is even grief, just to kind of root us in the almost like the word that comes with diversity, but just the many ways of what grief and death means in our lives. And I'm also bringing it up because being trans and queer and Muslim and just these kind of things, there's so much death happening around me, and I've kind of come to this work just out of necessity for survival, and also as a community organizer. If you're ever going to create change, I've done it for many years, and I've just come back to the only way to do change is that interpersonal relationships that we build, because everything's keep falling apart because we are in constant conflict with each other. We don't know how to navigate the massive death and grief that we're experiencing. Is just this complete, even here saying the spiritual, what do you call it? Closing or, yeah. So that's kind of how I come into it. So I would just love to bring it more into the room as well.
Well, just on grief, I have to quote you. Where you write, if unaddressed, grief will find a way to make itself known. And yeah, I think I worry less about death than unaddressed grief, maybe. Because when I think about unaddressed grief, I think about all the ways that the earth is grieving. And I think about the ways that the oceans have changed since the great catastrophe of transatlantic slavery, and how migratory patterns of sharks have changed because of that, following the ships, and also how ecosystems and ecologies underwater have changed because of the wooden hulls of the ships, and how it's drastically led to warming of the planet. And so I often think about this haunting that's happening, Earth is being haunted, and something that's useful for me in terms of grief. I look to literature a lot, and then sharing that is useful for me in terms of grief. So people's writings around grief and reconciling this kind of haunting or hauntology that happens.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know if we'll ever be able to not be haunted yeah, we all wish that this genocide in Gaza would be the last genocide we'd see, and it's the first time we see such kinds of images on our screens with such readily available, instantaneous but so that's where we're at. We are in it. But I think about Edward Glissant, who talks about what he calls trembling thinking. What it might mean to do trembling thinking. And I also think of the tremble of the body, of the nervous system, of the earth. To be with that as a kind of maybe a methodology that actually, how do we care in that sense too, when you can't stop the tremble, but we're in it, we're so connected. So for me, death care is grief care, is life care. And I also work a lot with people who are grieving too on their journeys. And I also work a lot with people who are dealing with fear and anxiety around death, their own death or the death of their loved ones. And for me, it always comes back to death. I guess that's it. When we're building out a sort of mortality awareness that helps us live in connection with the truth of death, I think also of how Stephen Jenkinson, who wrote Die Wise, he said somewhere, no death, no soil, no life. So how actually, if we just start from there, how that would change our grieving practices? Because we are finding some way to live with impermanence and change, and how to care also for ourselves through that, like chaplain ourselves somehow. To the edges of that, we'll always need to be together. And grief is just so much part of life. But yeah, if we're not addressing grief, if we're not addressing death, the pain, the grief and death only magnifies. And then I think that's where the suffering begins. If pain is something that we have to, as they say, like that grief is the price you pay for love. Also to think too about the force of grief as not only something that's negative, but actually is the fuel for activism, for us, finding love through conflict, as a sort of energy to help us move, while we also try to move grief, how to keep it moving.
Are you also leading group workshops on grief as well?
Yeah, here and there. And there is a workshop that I did last week where it was really focused on presencing. So what does it mean to really develop an intentional practice of sensing, building sense and awareness, so feeling and knowledge of that for the present moment, to bear it. And trying to practice that actually with a small group of people, really focused on a small cube of ice melting. So actually it's kind of an experiment where the group, we become a unique composition that is bearing witness to an event. And to practice in a way that, the rehearsal is the real thing. This, of course it's not. These things are distinct, but how we train in the moment for what's to come. And it's incredible because once everyone commits, okay, we are going to take incredibly seriously that this ice is melting. So many connections there too, but it's transforming. And how can we do that in a reverent way? How can we bear witness to it and help each other do it and also care for ourselves? Like how this is all in communion with each other. And it's incredible what people come up with in this moment. So before the ice block cube arrives, we discuss, okay, what are we going to do? We know this is coming. So how are we going to do this? And then suddenly there's all these ideas. It's such a creative practice. Then the ice arrives, and then it's all playing out. And it's incredible what we did with the water once it had melted, and we anointed ourselves. And then there was a little water left, and then someone said, well, what we should do is actually make a tower of our hands. And then you take the bowl of water and then pour it over, and it will slowly trickle. So all of this, it's all a practice. Maybe I'm going off on a tangent, but the group work is, that these moments can also be a chance where there's things to do together, to practice together. Of course, then there's this dynamic where we're over here, you're over there.
It can't happen in isolation. Grief work, I think. It has to happen in community with others.
Yeah, and it might take time, when you're by yourself, you're figuring out, you're in a process. Like, what are my needs? How are my needs changing and evolving to hold this? And then always we're coming in and out of each other's lives to keep changing. My death care has been completely transformed with, the violent deaths that we see, the mass death of, as you said, multiple pandemics or multiple world endings, and it keeps changing. And then the profundity of it all is that once you really see that it's so transforming you, you just can't live the same way. And then you divest from as much as you can from what is poisoning. And again, just like with the kind of, with living in this body, approaching care, it's all messy too. It's messy. So how to keep learning together. It's also part of it, this learning practice. I'm changed with every person I encounter through death and dying and through grief. It's also not stagnant.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to say thank you so much for this presentation, and it has moved me in ways I can't tell you anything about. But I was just it was kind of just a thought that appeared during both of your presentation. And it's because I've been working in healthcare and mostly taking care of like old people, also on the verge kind of to someplace else. And there has been some occasions where the patients have been experiencing near-death experiences. Yeah. And I feel that I'm sorry, I'm just nervous, like talking in the microphone. But I was just wondering if, because my experience is that the reason for why the institutions cannot kind of carry these like experiences that people can have is like I have an intuition that it's maybe about that we in a Western like society have a really hard time seeing the relationship between spirit and matter, because when people have these experiences, it's not, I mean, of course you could measure the body and maybe like see that some things are actually happening, like during a heart, like when the heart stops, or but most of the experiences are of a very religious, sometimes very kind of abstract way that they very struggle to kind of, you know, talk about, and most of the times they're not encouraged to talk about this. So I was just wondering about, like, if you have experienced like anything, just if you can say something about the relationship between spirit and matter, or just
Yeah, I immediately just feel for you and these people you have also witnessed in that. And the infrastructures, the time crunch, the efficiency of medical care and these forms, how it just can't hold it. I think it's all the more reason that we need more situations and spaces that we create to do this and to become more experimental about ways it can be held. You know, so often it will just have to happen in that care room, in the facility, and you're there and you're suddenly illustrating that you're next to the ocean because that's just what the person needs, and suddenly you're there. I just know that what we can try now is more and more build up what that means to us, that relationship with the unseen, with spirit, with signs. And you'll be really surprised about what you will find. Sure, there can be so much scientism about it all, and that's also incredibly interesting, fascinating. But there's still so much that can't be explained. It's clear, though, that consciousness doesn't arise in the mind. It's not created by the mind. So there is a sort of motherboard we're connected to. How we are just able to be around the dinner table and talk about that with people. What that means, how to listen to it. But of course, how to also listen to it ourselves. Like just on the walk over here, you know, people don't really look each other in the eyes in many places, but like walking over here, I didn't catch a lot of eyes. And then I caught someone's eyes. And it was intense. Because also this person was really like, I don't know, something happened. And then you immediately think like, oh, is that person okay? Or like, you know, I don't know what that was, but that was something. And then just before entering into this building, you know, these birds that are communicating with each other at the top of the building, just pausing to listen. You know, just know you're not alone, even when you feel alone in this material body, I think. How to tune in to that. But yeah, I also have a lot more trust from experiences that I've had and others that I've learned from, that it's going to be okay. Actually, people have been being born and dying for a long time. We're part of that. Just how to trust in at least that, how to do that, yeah.
When I think about spirit and matter, I think about getting into spaces that are more transcendent. And I think it could be really simple. So nature spaces, communing with children, they're so close to the spiritual world. And dancing and music, I think about the long lineages of sonic traditions in the African diaspora and how those are transcendent spaces, where a lot of like spiritual transformation and flux is supposed to happen, and it's supposed to thin the veil. And so like leaning more into those, spaces of outer body, outer otherworldly experiences.
But also merges to something else as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like this, the flipping point in a way.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I understand.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, really beautiful. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I have two questions. So one which is maybe easy. I'm really curious as to hear how you got into this. And secondly, why do you think that we have a tendency to equate death with grief and loss, so that the language with which we talk about death is already quite scripted in ways that I think is very interesting? When you have experienced death, people have a tendency to always meet you with an expectation of feeling a certain way, right? So the scripts, we have these very narrow scripts with when it comes to feelings, and love is supposed to feel good. Although we have a lot of cultural stories that are about like the end of love, or that love can hurt, but we don't really have that many diverse stories about what death, the range of feelings that you can actually have. I mean, you did mention that there is quite some strength and energy and activism that can come out of death and maybe grief. But do you have any experiences to share with how we can maybe diversify the way we meet death and people who have lost, right? So this language of loss, maybe it's not about loss, right? So how can we maybe start breaking some very strict scripts? I was wondering maybe if you can talk to your experience from your practice.
That's a beautiful question. There's so many culturally encoded scripts, as you say. I just know, like, the mind has a lot of trouble understanding absence. Like, also on the neuroscience level. Like, there's just it's so beautiful in the book The Grieving Brain by Mary Frances O'Connor. She has this incredible analogy for just basically like how things are like laid out in our perception. In all of our relationships, they're made up of this like intimate braid of like quality of attachment, time and sort of frequency of interaction, and space. So we also place people in various spots in space and time, and so it's also a matter of, if you call with a loved one always on the weekend, or there's a place, or you see someone every day. Maybe it's your neighbor, but you're not really close. So there's this sort of braid of how we understand our connections. But it's also a lot like, the brain wants to sort of take less effort where possible. So just like in your home, you've been there long enough that you know where all the furniture is. You can turn the lights off in the middle of the night, wake up and go get a drink from the refrigerator. You know to dodge the table. You know that it's there, but then suddenly the table's gone. And it's a little bit like, what's happening? Where am I? So that's a really sort of simplified and innocent sort of example. But there's such trouble in acute grief and then also in the grieving process. So grieving is our adaptation to loss over time. That adaptation is trying to relearn what the relationship is. So as we continue our relationships with our loved ones when they are no longer in their body, in another form, because they're still there in our wiring. Our loved ones, our dead loved ones are still there. The body and brain have to figure out what that means. And so I think that when we are more grief literate about how grieving works, we will change the script. We will have different ways of talking about it, because what grief is like an acute experience of learning, like literally learning when you're studying a language or like learning something new. It's disorienting. And yeah, it's incredible that with our perception boxes, there's just really like two ways to change your perception. You know, that it's either through the stories of other people and learning secondhand, or it's firsthand, being initiated into rites of passage yourself. So if we are in that sort of choreography of learning from each other and learning through our own experiences, how are we able to share it and make these new scripts? I think we can always pausing helps across the board in life, to just also take a second to pause to think what's happening. And when somebody says, my loved one just died, there's no fixing, there's no solution. It's taking a breath and then finding out from the other person, what do you need right now? What shall we do? I think that it's just through crafting different practices, we will find different ways to talk about this. And we can also say death and dying, huh? We say lost and past. But we can say, we can say it. When you've lost someone, yeah. I don't know. It's just a little bit around the bush.
I think that the question is really culturally specific. I think it's from a Western landscape, perhaps, because where I'm from in the Black diaspora, it's a celebration. When oftentimes when someone dies, we call it going home, and it's always a big party. And I was delighted to find so many intersections between the way that we interact with death and grief, where I'm from in the Black American South, and when I went to Zambia 2 summers ago, and I was in the south of Zambia visiting with people from the Tonga tribe, and one of the traditions that they have, it's called eating the names. And when someone dies, someone else has to eat their name, and they have to take their name, and then they become that person in terms of their responsibilities. So if someone's father dies and someone eats their name, that person becomes the father to those children, or they become the brother to that person. And so they kind of continue and carry on that lineage. So the loss doesn't feel so heavy for those individual people to bear. And I think that's, to talk about transgenerational healing, it's just something that's natural, I think, in a lot of Indigenous communities. And when you talk about rewriting the script, I'm thinking about also where you wrote in your book about your niece and the dog dying. And their parent writing a different script around death. And I think that's the work to do, is to just change it for yourself, and the people around you.
Yeah, so well said. And actually these like ritual creations that we can do, or looking into our own lineages to find those rituals. And also there's so much to learn from other cultures too, without appropriation, to become inspired, to honor those various ways in which death and grief is done.
Ritual is meant to be DIY. You could just, go ahead.
Yeah, and we're doing them so often, all the time, but just without a lot of thought. Where do we give a little bit more thought and sense to? I think is really powerful. But yeah, that the dog is now in the stars, in a particular constellation of stars. They can always go see him. You know, what does it mean to make that new, these new connections, this new map, I think is really, really valuable.
There was also a second question about just curiosity, I think. How did you get into this work?
Yeah, just a calling, as they say. By necessity too, you know, that, but it's just when you feel it and you have to answer it. You know, at some point you just have to answer the call. It's ringing and ringing, and then I also really, think a lot too about how time is arriving for me and what's happening in my life, and I really care about care work, also on these structural systemic levels, but also just in these, these ephemeral in-between moments. And I have, my dream is to make a kind of Grace's hospice, basically. Like I want to make a space for a more holistic experience of death and dying, but also it functions as a sort of grief house and community center where just people are coming there. And we also work with hospice. It's not to replace, it's the thing complementary about just certain systems that are already there to support the dying, but it's a lot of coming together. So this work now is just the practice towards a physical location for me. I wanted to also have an artist residency, and there will be a garden, and just people are there. People are part of it, and we find some way to make it run, with money, important part, but that it can be a space that's flourished and cared for by the community, and maybe only lasts as long as it needs to. And then something else will come. But I think that will be a really meaningful life for me.
I love this manifestation.
I have a question, but I know we're also kind of towards the end of our time together. So if someone else has a question, then I don't want to take time for mine. Are there any other questions? No other questions. I just I'm curious about, you've spoken to me a little bit about this, and I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the overlaps between your artistic work, I guess both of you, but it's a little more clear to me what it looks like for you, Jessica, than for you, Staci. The overlaps between your artistic and curatorial work and this work, and how you find that these two are aligned or linked or connected.
Yeah, for me, there's a lot of natural connections. I think, well, I just really professionalized as a curator, so in some ways I have sort of curatorial mind, how I think about building connections, working with people, just the sort of relationship of things. And it's incredible that that this book can actually hold experience and sharing, that it's really, I took really seriously writing as a craft. I wanted to really experiment and actually do different things than how I'm used to writing classic curatorial or academic texts. I wanted to just, to practice, literary devices that I could see how they were transporting me and how they could maybe transport a reader, so of course this is how books work, but I would write a completely different book now. So it's really this sort of, what are our points of expression along the way? I also say somewhere too that this is my only book about death and dying. But maybe it would look different along the line if I'm more like living at that edge myself with a sort of known terminal situation. I might write something really different, but I would write something different every time. But so, these connections are interesting for me. My current project is working on new commissions for the hospice where I volunteer. I want there to be really intentional artworks that can be in this space. I think it's, also art is part of that community in these situations. There's a lot of interesting stuff about, art and care settings and things like that. But for me, it's never incredibly inspiring works. But I've always needed it. Even if it's this sort of strange painting of a cow and then I needed it there in that hallway. Riding down in the bed on wheels, rushing to my emergency cesarean, for example. I needed that somehow. And I think if art can be a little bit more a part of these settings will also change us. The art will also change us in just different ways. I think, I also really respect the institution of art and it doing its thing for also itself and its regeneration. But I also really want there to be art in life. And so that for me is a big connection point. And, and its related things, design, architecture, all of this, that it's in communion too. And I just wanted to say too, because you have met with Jolie, is it Joel or Jolie? Simone, the grave woman.
Yes.
Jolie or
it's
Joel?
Joel. Yes.
This is really incredible because you mentioned that you had met and spent time with a black death care worker in the South.
Yeah.
And I didn't know exactly who. I immediately, what first popped in my mind was the grave woman. That's what she calls herself, Joel, Simone or Simone. And it's just so important that we have, in this rise of death care workers, all of us on board, but especially the culturally specific care that's needed. She teaches so many about Black hair care, post-mortem care, how vital that is, how important that is on so many levels. So when we talk also about care in the landscape of death and grief, literally in these moments after where you're caring dressing the body, getting the body ready for presentation, for ceremony. You need all of this. It's a part of it's the domain of the living.
We're speaking about a person who was my guide when I went to the Low Country, which is North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida in the U.S. this past summer. And her name is Joelle Simone, and she's a death care worker, former mortician, but she does these classes for other morticians on how to care for black hair and do black makeup. And she's just, and it does these tours on black sites of grief and death. And yeah, I learned so much from her about also artistic practice, and what it means to be in service to the work and let it guide you. And a final thing I wanted to say on answering the call, because you asked the question, what does it mean to be in service to death? And you asked, how did you get into death work? And I think it's a question we can all ask ourselves and maybe answer in a year. To share a final quote from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, the poet, she asked, and we can ask ourselves, what would it mean to go deep with each other? What are the scales of intimacy and the actual practices that would teach us how to care for each other beyond obligation or imaginary duties? Yeah.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Staci.